Straits of Malacca, 1948. The wireless operator on a ship is referred to, good-naturedly, as Sparks. The nickname Sparks was a byproduct of the early days of wireless communications on ships, when wireless sets would produce a train of high-voltage sparks which created radio waves messages were sent on. Though the technology had improved in the roughly 4 decades of its use on ships, the name hadn't fully fizzled out yet. Many crews still called the wireless operators on their ships the nickname. Sparks, on the United States vessel Silver Star, was a young man sitting at his desk and writing reports. The headset Sparks wore was filled with indiscriminate buzzing of various Morse code messages, which he was only half paying attention to. Most were merely distant messages not meant for him, which he was merely intercepting. Ships out in the Gulf of Thailand or the Andaman Sea, or even as far away as the Bay of Bengal, sending messages back and forth to each other, along with chatter from a few international listening stations set up around the region. Most of the ships were local to the region, though. However, there were several U.S. and other Allied ships in the region too, and there had been since the end of World War II 3 years earlier. The Sparks in this ship, the Silver Star, enjoyed the nickname and only ever went by it when on board. He was a young man who had joined the United States Navy in the last year of World War II. Following the war, he was shifted around from ship to ship for a few years before being assigned to the Silver Star earlier in the year. His cabin on the Silver Star was small, barely room enough for his bunk, desk, and a place for his clothes, but he found it cozy. The small room had no windows and was illuminated by ceiling lights. The small crew of the Silver Star were tight-knit and had taken him in with open arms, though there was some good-natured picking made at him by the veterans of the ship. Such things were usual for any new arrival on a ship to expect, though. But the Silver Star captain made sure nothing became too extreme. He was one of the best captains Sparks had ever served under. A tough man with a gruff attitude, but also fair, and he cared for the well-being of his crew while also demanding a tight ship be run. At the current moment, Sparks didn't have any major duties to perform, so he was filling out some paperwork while sitting at the desk in his cabin. Next to him was his wireless set. It was on, and he had the headset over his ears. He wasn't paying particular attention to the messages buzzing through the driver, only enough to know if anything was important or meant for him. He'd only just finished one of the many reports he had to fill out and was setting it aside on his desk when he heard a new message suddenly blare through his headset. It was so loud in his ears compared to the other distant messages that Sparks jerked in surprise and lifted one of the driver units off his ears as the sound blared loudly out of them. Sparks huffed in annoyance and listened to the dots and dashes from the new ship, waiting for the message to pass. His face slowly began to turn from annoyance to concern and then to alarm. Once it set in what he was hearing, he dropped what he was doing, put the headset back on over his ears, grabbed a pad and paper and pencil, and rushed to write the message down. The message was an SOS, and Sparks hurried to write it down as it continued to blast loudly into his ears. The ship sending it must have been close by for the buzzing to be as loud as it was. At first it appeared to be a normal distress call, but then it turned sinister, and he paused his writing. "What the hell?" he muttered. For a moment, he sat still and listened, as the message described a horrifying scene, his alarm only growing, before he snapped out of it and continued to quickly write the message down. It abruptly changed from a clear message to a mess of Morse code which made no sense. The dots and dashes were all confused nonsense, and Sparks was about to try sending a reply to the message when suddenly it became intelligible again. And Sparks swore he felt his own blood turn icy at the chilling words which came through the headset next. Once the message concluded, he sat his pencil down, ripped the paper he'd written the message on off its pad, and hastily sent back a reply to the distressed ship. "Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star. We hear your SOS." He was about to rush up to the bridge, standing and taking several steps towards his cabin door, when he paused, hurried back to the wireless set, and added an additional reply. "Stand by." With that, Sparks flew from his chair, tore his door open, and bolted from the cabin and up to the bridge. When a ship was in distress, there was no time to waste, and the message Sparks had just heard implied the Ourang Medan was in a very bad way. The officers and crew on the bridge barely had time to register his frantic footsteps slamming on the deck outside before Sparks all but flew into the room. "Captain! Sir! A distress call has just come through!" he panted. "Who from, Sparks?" the captain of the Silver Star asked. "The Ourang Medan!" Sparks gasped. "The who?" the captain replied. Wordless, Sparks held out the slip of paper that had the message on it, and the captain snatched it. He read the message silently, and then turned to look at Sparks again. "Is this a joke, Sparks?" he asked. Captain Ernest Hazley was a gruff man, and he didn't take kindly to practical jokes on his ship. He commanded professionalism from his crew, and expected their best. He had no patience for jokes of inappropriate nature, which he felt the message he was holding might very well have been. "No, sir!" Sparks insisted as Hazley eyed him, looking unconvinced. "What does it say, sir?" Hazley's first officer, Adam Hanley, asked. Looking at the bridge crew, who were standing at attention around him, Hazley began to read the SOS aloud. "SOS from Ourang Medan. We float. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room and on the bridge. Probably whole of crew dead." Then Sparks wrote that the next part of the message was just a confused mess of dots and dashes that made no sense. He paused. Then, "These last two words are all that came through?" he asked, eyeing Sparks again. Sparks nodded, so the Silver Star captain read the final two words of the message to the rest of the crew. "I die." Silence fell over the bridge, save for the humming of the ship's engines below them, and everyone felt a chill pass through them. Hazley sighed, handed the message back to Sparks, and asked, "There was nothing about any location?" Sparks shook his head and the captain nodded. "Sparks, go back below and see if anyone else heard this," Hazley ordered. Sparks saluted. "Yes, sir," he gasped and bolted from the bridge and back to his cabin. Hazley watched him go, then looked outside at the vessel City of Baltimore, which was sailing alongside the Silver Star. It was the only other ship in the immediate area as far as he was aware. He looked at his first officer. "Signal the City of Baltimore, ask if they heard it." Hanley nodded and stepped outside and began visual communications to relay the message to their fellow ship. Within moments he had returned and stepped back onto the bridge. "They heard it too, sir," he reported. "They couldn't reach Sparks, so they were about to signal us and see if we heard it." The captain nodded. "Tell them to stand by until we know more." Hanley stepped outside again to relay the new message. Hazley then went down and into the wireless room. "Well, Sparks, did anyone else hear it?" Sparks was in the middle of sending a new message. "Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star. We've heard your SOS. Please respond. Ourang Medan, please respond, old man. We need your position." But he was only met with silence after each message. When Hazley entered the room, Sparks turned around in his chair to face him. "Yes, sir. Several British and Dutch listening posts are confirming they heard it too," he reported. "And a few other ships miles out, the Bay of Bengal and the Gulf of Thailand, are asking about it too." "Did any of them hear anything else from the Ourang Medan?" Hazley asked. "No, sir. There's been no further message from the ship," Sparks replied. "I've been trying to get in contact again to get her position, but there's nothing." "Okay, keep trying, and see if those listening posts can triangulate a location," Hazley said, leaving the cabin and returning to the bridge. "Sir, what are we doing?" the helmsman asked once the captain was back on the bridge. "Well, right now there's nothing we can do, lad. We have no idea where this Ourang Medan might be. All we can do for now is wait for Sparks to come through on a location. Either the listening outposts who heard the message will determine it, or the Ourang Medan will send another message with coordinates." For the next hour, the crew on the bridge waited with tension in the air, no one willing to break the silence. The Silver Star and City of Baltimore continued their set courses, both going at half speed ahead, remaining side by side as they exchanged visual communications every 15 or so minutes. In his cabin, Sparks tapped his pencil on his desk in frustration, listening as all the other communications he now heard were discussing the ship, but no one had a location. The Dutch and British listening posts chatted back and forth constantly at first, working together to try and locate the point of origin for the SOS. However, they'd gone quiet for far too long, in Sparks' opinion. Finally, one of the British listening posts came back after being silent for a long time and announced that they'd worked with the other listening posts around the region and triangulated the message origin to a rough location. They sent the closest approximation they managed to work out, and Sparks quickly wrote it down before he again bolted from the room and up to the Silver Star's bridge. He burst into the room gasping for breath and began speaking. The listening posts were able to work together and triangulate the area the ship is in. Approximately, at any rate. Us and the city of Baltimore are the closest ones, sir, Sparks reported. The Ourang Medan's position should be somewhere around 8 degrees, 12 minutes, 25.707 seconds north, 96 degrees, 3 minutes, 36.2017 seconds east. They don't think it's quite right, but it's approximately right in the middle of all the possible spots they worked out. Hazley went to his chart and began working to determine where the Ourang Medan would be located compared to the Silver Star. It's at the end of the Strait of Malacca, right at the edge of the Andaman Sea. That's a whole lot of empty ocean. Since we only have approximate location, she could be anywhere around there. He trailed off as he looked down at the map, tapping the desk with his finger as he considered his next move. What do you want to do, sir? He heard Hanley ask. Silver Star captain looked around at his crew. Turn the ship around. Head west. I'll work out a more proper course in a minute, he said. We're the closest ship to her, aside from the city of Baltimore. Whatever happened, the Ourang Medan is obviously in some kind of distress. There is a very real possibility that a danger to human life is present. It's our duty to investigate and save anyone if we can. So step to it. Get the lifeboat swung out and prepare to receive survivors. I want to talk to the chief engineer, get him up here, and I want him to put all the steam he can give me, I don't care what he has to cut off to get it, into the engines so we can go fast. Put all routine work on pause, and get the ship's medical officer up here too. He then turned to Sparks. Tell the city of Baltimore captain to have him hold their course. We're going to break off and head for the Ourang Medan. Until we know exactly what we're getting into, there's no need for us both to charge in blindly into a potentially dangerous situation. Sparks left the bridge as the other officers and crew scrambled to complete Hazley's orders. Captain Hazley worked the new course for the Silver Star out in a matter of minutes, almost dead northwest from the Silver Star's current position. Pushing the ship to the fastest speed she'd ever mustered, he remained on the bridge as she veered off from the city of Baltimore and towards the empty horizon. It would take a few hours to reach the rough area the Ourang Medan should be in, and Hazley remained on the bridge for the entirety of the voyage, scanning the horizons for any signs of the ship. It was well into the afternoon before a speck finally materialized over the horizon. A tiny black dot which stood out against the clear blue sky and the deep blue water. She's about 10 miles out, Hanley reported, raising some binoculars to his eyes. Hazley looked out the forward-facing windows and then at his mate. What do you see? Well, it's a ship, but I don't know if it's ours. Someone else could have been closer to the Madonna and decided to do what we're doing. He handed the binoculars to Hazley, who raised them up to his own eyes. There's no smoke coming out of her smokestack. The message said, we float, not we're sailing. I think that might be her. Helmsman, adjust by 2 degrees to port, maintain speed, we're heading in close. The Silver Star closed the distance, dashing ahead at full speed. Finally, when they were around only a mile and a half out from the ship, did Hazley order the speed of the ship to be reduced to half. And then, when they were 3/4 of a mile out, he ordered it be reduced to slow ahead. Slowly, the Silver Star came alongside the drifting vessel. It was indeed drifting. There was no power moving her. Most of the crew of the Silver Star gathered up onto the top deck to look at the mystery ship they'd come so far to find. She was still and silent, and as the Silver Star drew closer, there was no sound or greeting issuing out from the ship. Hazley ordered his ship closer to look for anything to determine the identity of the drifting ship, wanting to know if it was the right one or if it was just an abandoned derelict they'd happened upon by chance. The ship was not new. Her hull was clearly weathered. The freighter seemed to be at least a decade old, if not getting close to two. No smoke was rising from her lone smokestack. If all was well aboard her, smoke should have been belching out and she should have been underway instead of drifting. There were no lights on in any of the windows. In fact, all the windows on the ship were dark. There was a mast at the forward and aft end of the ship, and a third just forward of her smokestack, which jutted out from her center. The lifeboats were all swung out and ready to be loaded and lowered, but there was no one on deck waiting to board them or crew waiting to lower them. The Silver Star moved in closer, and Hazley spotted something on the freighter's bow. On both sides of the drifting vessel's bow was a teak nameplate, which removed any doubt about the identity of the ship. The Silver Star finally came along the port side of the ship, and the crew could easily read Ourang Medan in clear English text on the port side plaque. The Silver Star crew hailed the vessel, but she remained silent, drifting forward in the current with waves splashing up against her hull. In his cabin, Sparks was trying to contact the ship, but he never got any response. It would be impossible to miss. If her wireless operator responded, it would have been ear-splitting. Being so close to the mystery ship made her silence unsettling. Captain Hazley stepped out of the Silver Star bridge with a megaphone and shouted, "Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star responding to your SOS. Please respond." The ship remained still and eerily offered no response. The Silver Star crew had all fallen silent as well. The only sound was the ocean waves. "Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star responding to your SOS signal. Please respond." Captain Hazley tried again, but there was still no response. He sighed deeply and lowered the megaphone. "All right, we can't wait. Something is clearly wrong." He turned to Hanley. "We're going aboard. Get volunteers for a search party. I want at least a dozen men." "Yes, sir," the mate responded, hurrying out of the bridge and down to the forward deck of the Silver Star. Hazley also left the bridge a moment later. The door to the Silver Star's wireless room opened and Hazley stepped inside. "Well, Sparks?" he asked. Sparks turned around in his seat and stood up. "Yes, sir?" "Has she sent anything else over the wireless?" Hazley asked. Sparks shook his head. "No, sir," he said. "Tell everyone else listening to stand by," Hazley replied, nodding to the wireless operator, then leaving the room again. Sparks adjusted his headset and sat back down at the desk, sending out the message over the telegraph. It didn't take long for a boarding party of more than a dozen to be assembled on deck, with Captain Hazley approving each volunteer. Aside from the captain, First Officer Hanley, Second Officer Walsh, and Fourth Officer Miles, 19 other Silver Star crew members would make up the boarding party. Third Officer Johnston was being left in command of the Silver Star until Captain Hazley's return. Of the Silver Star crew members going aboard the Ourang Medan, one was the ship's photographer, a young man named Jimmy Weddle. Captain Hazley wanted to be the first aboard the Medan, but his first officer stepped in his way. "Until we know what's going on over there, perhaps it's best if I go first. You're more important, sir." Hazley, knowing he couldn't argue with his first mate, simply nodded after a moment and allowed the officer to board the Medan first. The silent freighter loomed alongside the smaller Silver Star as the boarding party and crew alike made the final preparations for boarding the vessel. Finally, as everyone watched with bated breath, Hanley boarded the ship alone. He climbed up onto her deck and looked around and paused. "Oh my God," he whispered as he took in the sight in front of him. After a moment, he turned around and waved to the others. "Come on over," he called. Everyone could see he was shaken by something, and this time, Hazley was not to be put off. He followed second, and he, along with everyone else in the boarding party, saw what had shaken Hanley so deeply. Across the deck were strewn bodies, the bodies of the Ourang Medan crew. Most were lying on their backs, but some laid on their faces or rested slumped up against rails or walls. A dog was sprawled on its belly near one wall as well. Those on their backs gazed up at the sky with blank expressions, their eyes glassy and dead, and holding no spark of life, and their skin was turning gray and black as it decomposed, but there was no reek of death that one should expect from bodies being in the state that they were in. It was as if they'd been dead for days or weeks, but it didn't smell like it. There was no signs of any injury or cause of death on the deceased crew. The bodies looked untouched, and it was as if everyone had just dropped dead. "What the hell?" someone behind Hazley asked. "Watch where you step," Hazley eventually said. "Don't hit them. Look around for any survivors, but stay on deck. Miles, make sure everyone keeps their heads on their shoulders. Hanley, Walsh, and you two," he said, pointing to the last two Silver Star crew members climbing aboard the Medan. "You all come with me to the bridge. Let's see if we can find the log." As the crew began checking to see if anyone lying among the bodies was still alive, the small group headed up to the bridge. Hanley led the way up a staircase which led to the bridge and opened the door. The walls inside were made of dark brown wood. At the front, by large windows, was a wheel and some navigation tools. Behind them was a counter, and at the back of the bridge was a wall filled with various controls, such as the watertight door control system, and communication equipment for talking directly to the engine room crew. There were two doors on the back wall, and a locker, which was shut and locked with a padlock. There were some papers lying on the counter, but none gave any clues about the ship or her destination, and there was no logbook visible. There were no bodies on the bridge, and Hazley fiddled with the padlock on the locker, but he couldn't get it unlatched. "You two," he said, turning around and pointing at the two crewmen who had accompanied him and the officers up to the bridge. "See if you can get this open. Maybe the logbooks are in here," he said. They nodded, and one said, "Let's see if there's a key or maybe something we can cut the lock with in one of the back rooms." They went to one of the closed doors at the back of the bridge and opened it. As they did, Hazley turned around to his second officer. "Walsh, help the others on the deck." "Hanley," he said, turning to face his first, "we're going to go find the wireless operator." The wireless operator, who had been sending messages only hours prior, was in the same state as everyone else on the Ourang Medan. He was visibly decomposing, looking like he'd been dead for a week in the heat. Yet he'd been alive hours earlier. His hand still grasped the wireless telegraph transmitter knob, like he died right after sending the words, "I die." As if he'd known whatever had killed everyone else was coming for him. He was all alone aboard the derelict. Dry drool had dripped out of his mouth and pooled around his head, which had fallen onto the desk face first. His body was slumped like he'd slowly slipped down into that position. He still wore his headset as well. The wireless set itself was out of power, and any attempt to reactivate it by Hazley and Hanley had failed. "Captain," Hanley muttered, clearly disturbed and maybe even slightly frightened, though he didn't show this. Hazley was sympathetic, but needed his first officer at his best right then. "I know. Look, Hanley, I want you to round up some men and head below. See if there's anyone alive below deck. If you don't find anyone, just come back up top." "See if you can get the lights on," Hanley said, motioning to a power box on the wall with the flashlight he'd brought over from the Silver Star. A crewman from the party nodded and opened the power box, flipping some of the switches inside, but the hallway remained dark. "Clearly they won't turn on because there is no power," they muttered to themselves, closing the box again. Hanley had rounded up a group of 5 men to accompany him below decks into the interior of the ship. They descended down a stairwell and come out into a tight, empty hallway within the interior of the ship, so it had no windows to let outside light in. They'd realized quickly that, yes indeed, the Ourang Medan was dark on the inside, like they'd thought when they'd seen no lights on in any of her windows when approaching on the Silver Star. They'd gone down a few decks and seen no bodies, but the halls being empty did not help anyone to feel any more at ease, especially with the ship being dark and silent on the inside. No one had the nerve to peek into any of the open doorways, not even Hanley, who had the only flashlight. As they made to walk down the hall, the small group stopped when the sound of groaning, strained metal sounded throughout the hallway. The Ourang Medan groaned loudly all around the group for several moments before she went silent again. Why would she be making that sound? Another crewman asked. Hanley shook his head. Maybe she's taking on water. Let's go down to the engine room and have a look. You head back out on deck and tell the captain we're going below to see if she has damage. He'll want to know if she's taking on water, he said, and a young deckhand from the Silver Star nodded and hurried back down the corridor, vanishing from sight quickly. They heard the door to the stairwell open and close after a few seconds, and faint steps hurrying back up the dark metal steps to the top deck. They faded quickly and the silence resumed, save for the nervous shuffling of the small team's bodies as they shuffled in place. One man who was standing with his back to a dark open doorway couldn't handle the void being right behind him, and he spun around, grabbed the knob, and pulled the door shut. Hanley turned and pointed the light at him, and he suddenly appeared sheepish in the beam of light. But Hanley felt just as uncomfortable and merely nodded. After a moment, the rest of the search party proceeded down the hall and descended the first set of stairs they came to. Upon arriving at the lower levels of the ship and entering the engine room, the stairwell ended in it by happy chance. One Silver Star crew member shivered and gasped. "It's cold," he said. The air, the floor and metal walls, were all chilly. Hanley nodded, realizing that he could see his breath in the beam of his flashlight. He slowly panned it around the dark room. Other than his light casting a bright spot wherever he pointed it, the rest of the room was dimly illuminated in a few locations by still burning lanterns, some of which seemed to be on the verge of burning out. One was sitting on a desk, one was hanging from a peg, one was hanging from a hatch on a boiler, and they cast dim yellow lights into the space around them, revealing that there were more bodies in this area of the ship before Hanley found them with his flashlight. The bodies of the engine room crew were slumped all around, decaying visibly like the ones on the deck had been. Despite the coolness of the space, they also looked like they'd been dead at least a week, if not more. In fact, the bodies seemed to be decaying so fast that by the time Hanley had returned, the bodies across the ship seemed to be decaying so fast that by the time Hanley had returned to the deck from the wireless room, the bodies on deck had turned a more black and rotting fleshy color, looking like they'd been dead several weeks. "That's not right," Hanley said, looking at the corpses before he lifted his light up and panned it around the room. "And this is why there's no power. The boilers are cold, and they have been for a while." While being so deep inside a ship felt like being within the vessel's belly, in truth, the engine room was more of the beating heart of a ship. If it stopped, the ship's heart stopped. The Ourang Medan's heart had stopped and was icy cold. "Hours at least," another crew member said in response. "It takes hours for an engine room to cool off, let alone grow frigid. And look over there," he added, pointing at the far end of the room, at a doorway barely illuminated by one of the lanterns. The watertight doors are closed. Why would they close the doors? She's sitting level. She's not taking on water. I don't know, Hanley replied, grabbing one of the lanterns and handing it to someone so they would have more than one light for the dark trip back up to the top. Then he approached the closed watertight door and tapped it with his flashlight. And it rang out. Yeah, there's no water in that compartment. It's not flooded on the other side of this, he said. Do you want us to open it? Someone in the group asked. Hanley shook his head. No, we don't know what's on the other side. A whole crew doesn't just drop dead like this for no reason, unless they have some hazardous cargo on board. And there might very well be a cargo hold behind this door, and if that's the case, this door might be the only thing keeping us from whatever they were carrying. He turned around and placed his hand on the bulkhead and paused. That's weird. The door is warm. It's not cold, like everything else down here. He stared at the door for a moment and then knocked on it, thinking the only reason it might be warm was if someone was on the other side keeping it warm. There was no answering knock. Hanley paused for another moment before motioning to the stairwell with his light. Let's head up top and get out of here. The rest of the group didn't need to be told twice. They were all more than ready to get out of the dark and chilly bowels of the Ourang Medan and back up into the warm and bright sunlight. They made their way back up the stairs and through the dark corridors inside the guts of the derelict ship. Returning to the warm sunlight and salty air did not come soon enough for those who had ventured down into the Ourang Medan's interiors and only found more death within her steel insides. Death in two ways, that being more confirmed human casualties than that of the ship, because with her boilers cold and engine shut down, she might as well have been as dead as her crew was. Hanley opened a doorway and stepped back out on deck, followed by the others. Anything new? He asked one of the Silver Star boarding party members who was leaning against one of the Medan's safety rails. The man shook his head and Hanley asked, Where's the captain? The man turned and motioned towards the open door in the superstructure with his head. Hanley made for the door but paused. Listen, take this, he said, handing the man his flashlight. See if you can find a way into the cargo holds and look around, will you? There was a closed watertight bulkhead down there. I was thinking at first maybe they closed it to keep whatever happened from spreading, but now I'm wondering if there's not someone alive who closed it to protect themselves from whatever happened here. The ship was cold down there, but the door was warm, so the room behind it has to be. If anyone is alive, cargo hold is a likely place they'd be hiding, so just go have a look. As he was giving this order, Miles had come out of the doorway in the superstructure and waited for him to be done before speaking. Just the man I was looking for. The captain sent me out here to see if anyone had seen you. He wanted you to come into the chart room if you were back on deck, he said. In the chart room, Captain Hazley was looking at the maps and navigation charts laid out on the table. But he wasn't getting too close due to the bodies slumped around the table. The SOS hadn't lied. The officers, some of them at least, and the captain, indeed were all lying in the chart room. The room wasn't very large, but it had 4 dead bodies in it. 3 officers lying sprawled out on their backs on the floor, and 1 body slumped over the table with the navigation charts on it. The wooden walls were the same dark brown as the bridge, and they added an eerie sensation to the room, as the decaying bodies almost matched its color tones. It seemed they had been trying to plot the quickest route back to land when they all died, like they were going to make a mad dash away from something, but died before they could even make the attempt. Where were they heading? Hazley asked, mostly to himself, once he'd stepped into the chart room and had a look at the scene. Walsh shook his head. I don't know. I haven't touched anything. I don't really want to go through any of this, especially since he's melting on the charts, he said, looking down at the deceased man slumped over the navigation charts, who he assumed to be the Ourang Medan's captain. Once I found the room, I thought you'd want to see it, he added. Hazley stared at the deceased captain lying in front of him and shook his head, squatting slightly to see what he could of the man's face, but the man was laying face down. Bodies don't decay this fast naturally. For a moment, none of the Silver Star crew gathered in the chart room, who had followed Hazley into the room when he entered, spoke. During this silence was when Hanley stepped into the room, and while just outside he'd overheard the last part of the conversation before the silence fell. "Sir, what are we going to do?" he asked after a moment when it was clear no one had any idea of what they should say. And what was there really to say about the situation they'd come across? It defied all logic. Hazley looked at Hanley next and asked, "What'd you find below? Anyone alive?" Hanley shook his head. "Just more bodies in the engine room. Boilers were cold too, and it seems like they have been for a while. Whole room was cold. Oh, and there was a closed watertight bulkhead down there, but it was warm. Thought at first they might have closed it to stop whatever happened here from happening. But then I thought maybe someone might have closed it themselves to hide behind it. If I had to pick a place where we'd find survivors, it'd probably be one of the holds. That room wouldn't be warm for no reason." Hazley paused a moment, considering what he wanted to do and if he wanted to launch any more searches into the interior of the ship after everything he'd seen so far. Then he finally came to a decision and said, "I want everyone to stop what they're doing. Don't touch anything. I don't know what happened here, but we are in over our heads on this. This needs to be investigated, and we're not equipped or qualified for it. We're going to rig up the tow line and tow this ship into port. We'll let experts look it over. And if anyone is alive, they'll be found by them." He turned to face Hanley. "Get the word out. I want everyone back on deck, and I don't want anyone to touch anything." Hanley nodded and left through the same door he'd come through and headed back out into the hallway. Hazley then turned to one of the youngest men who'd come aboard. "Jimmy, I want you to document everything as it is in its current state in case anything gets disturbed while we tow her into port. Put that camera to use. Start with our friend in the wireless room." Jimmy nodded, then left, and Hazley turned back to Miles. "Where is everyone?" He wanted his people spread across as little of the ship as possible. "Almost everyone is on deck, as you ordered, save the two lads on the bridge you told to break open the locked lockers, see if the logbooks were inside, and one man who Hanley sent below to the cargo holds before he came in here," Miles replied. "What'd he send someone down there for?" Hazley demanded. "Well, like he said, he sent the lad to check and see if any survivors were down there. If anyone is left and hiding somewhere on board, that'd be the first place I'd look too," Miles said. "Especially if a watertight door was closed. That might protect them from whatever happened. And he's right, that room wouldn't be warm for no reason." "I think that was one more thing worth investigating before we tow her in." Hazley huffed, but didn't argue. He instead walked out of the chart room as well. He stepped back out on deck and looked around at the dead crew, and then up at the Ourang Medan superstructure. "What happened to you, old girl? What happened to your crew?" he asked, wishing the ship could answer. Second Officer Walsh headed out of the chart room and walked to the Medan's port side railing and shouted down to the Silver Star, "Captain says get the tow line rigged! He wants to tow her in!" Johnston, who was standing at the door to the Silver Star's pilot house, nodded and quickly saluted to show he'd heard. On the forward deck, men rushed to prepare a line. The men worked quickly on both ships. It seemed everyone wanted the adventure to be over as soon as possible, and it only took a few minutes to get the line rigged. The Silver Star's stern was lashed to the Ourang Medan's bow, and Hazley's plan was for a few of his men to remain on board while the Silver Star towed the derelict back to port. Those who'd remain on board, including Hanley, were under strict orders to not touch anything or move any of the bodies. Hazley wanted the scene left as undisturbed as possible for the experts to examine. Just as the Silver Star crew were wrapping up the salvage operation preparations, and most were about to return to their own ship, a door suddenly burst open, and a lone Silver Star crew member, the one Hanley sent below, bolted out on deck. "Captain!" he gasped. "What?" Hanley said. Gasping for air, looking like he'd run up every stairwell on the ship, the man spat out, There's a fire raging in cargo hold number 4. Hazley looked at Hanley for a moment before he turned his gaze back to the gasping man and ordered, Show me. Leading the way back down, the frightened Silver Star crew member led Hazley and a few others down to the cargo hold and opened the door, which led out onto a catwalk above it. Below, an inferno was raging. The heat so intense they'd felt it before the door was even opened. Smoke gushed out from the flames, and an intense orange glow was consuming the few remaining crates in the hold. A doorway was opened below, and the flames had already spread through it and into the next room. Hazley didn't have to be told they didn't have the equipment to put out such a blaze, and if there was any on board, he doubted it, there wasn't time to find it. The Ourang Medan was doomed. The heat was already so intense in the room, from whatever was inside the burning crates, that he feared the coal stores in the boiler room might ignite at any time. For fire to be raging at such an out-of-control extent, Hazley realized the blaze must have been burning since before they'd even arrived. Forget it, we can't put that out, he said, motioning everyone back out of the door they'd come in through only moments after they'd stepped inside the hold. Everyone out! Get up top and abandon ship! Back to the Silver Star, he ordered, pulling the door to the hold shut to stop the smoke. Pushing everyone back out, they hurried back up through the hallway they'd come through, passing a lone fire axe mounted on the wall at the end of the hallway, for all the good it would have done at that moment. All the firefighting equipment on the Ourang Medan and the Silver Star combined would do no good to fight the blaze. The group hurried through a door at the end of the hall and up a set of stairs which led back out to the top deck. By the time they were back out, smoke was billowing out of the lower portholes in the bow section. Everyone, back to the Silver Star! Fire below deck! Abandon ship! Hazley shouted. Everyone dropped what they were doing and rushed to obey the order as Hazley urgently spoke to Hanley. That closed bulkhead door was warm because the room behind it was on fire. It's completely out of control. Help make sure everyone gets back to the Silver Star. Hazley then turned to Walsh. Are those two still up on the bridge? Yes, sir, Walsh replied. Go get them and tell them to get their asses off this ship now, Hazley said, in a calm tone but with a raised voice. Walsh nodded and ran for the steps which led up to the bridge, and Hazley turned to one of his crew, one of those who had gone below and seen the fire. Is everyone else here? There's no one else below, but Jimmy's still in the wireless room. Go get him, Hazley ordered. The shaken crewman nodded and turned to sprint for the wireless room. He opened the door and sprinted past the open chart room door as he felt the Medan shudder below his feet. He was running so fast that he had to reach out and use his arms to catch himself on the open wireless room door so he didn't slide past it, and he pulled himself back into the room. Jimmy was in the process of taking pictures in the room. Out on deck. Captain's ordered everyone off the ship, the crewman gasped. When Jimmy didn't immediately turn around, he stepped further into the wireless room and shouted, Come on! There's a fire below deck! Captain's ordering everyone off the ship now! Finally, Jimmy turned around. Okay, he said, whipping around and taking one additional photo, one of the dead wireless operator, before he turned and followed the other crewmen out of the room and back down the hall, fleeing the wireless room. Meanwhile, Walsh reached the top of the stairs leading to the Ourang Medan's bridge, and through the open door he saw the two Silver Star crew members Hazley had left less than 15 minutes ago still trying to pry open the locker with a crowbar. The locked door was finally starting to bend, though the lock was still holding, but Walsh didn't care at this point. Forget it, boys. Captain's ordered everyone back to the Silver Star. The captain told me to get into this locker. We've just about got the lock. Forget it. Hazley wants everyone off the ship now. Come on, there's a fire below deck. The ship is fucked. Hazley wants everyone back on the Silver Star now. Finally getting it, the two dropped the crowbar and ran for the bridge door. Walsh stood aside to let them pass and then followed them back down the metal stairs. Once they reached the deck, they sprinted to where the Silver Star crew were evacuating the doomed ship and heading back to their own, just as the other two sprinted out of the door to the superstructure and joined them. Hazley waited until everyone was off, even making sure 2 head counts were done to ensure no one was left aboard the Dutch freighter. If anyone had been, he would have gone to find them himself, before he followed his crew back to the Silver Star. Once he reached his ship, he hurried to the bridge and shouted, Cut the tow line! As one man hurried to do so, Hazley entered the bridge and shouted, "Set engines to full speed ahead! The second dot line is cut! Get us away from this ship!" The moment the line was severed, the Silver Star helmsman, Ozzy, lunged forward and through the ship's engine order telegraphed to "ahead full" after moving the handle to ring the engine room 3 times first. The props on the Silver Star spun to life quickly, and the Silver Star began to move, sliding over the water past the Ourang Medan, slow at first, but she quickly increased her speed. Nearly everyone on the Silver Star gathered at the aft deck to watch the Ourang Medan as they pulled away and as she shrank behind them, no longer seeming so massive and imposing as she had on their first approach. Smoke clouded around her, pouring from open doors and windows across the silent ship's forwardmost section, like a gaseous blood. The Silver Star was only a few hundred feet away from the Ourang Medan when the Medan finally made a sound. There was a sudden blast which shook the ship. With a lurch, the bow slightly rose or jumped ever so slightly out of the water for a moment, which erupted around it at the same time as the blast in angry white splashing foam before the bow settled back down into the sea, now with a visible and increasing forward list. Windows across the freighter were shattered apart by the blast, and the hull outside of the holds was torn open as the explosion ripped apart the metal body of the Ourang Medan. Still billowing out smoke from open doors and shattered windows, the Ourang Medan began to settle further forward as her bow flooded with water. Even with her watertight bulkheads closed, it was clear the explosion had ripped open a hole in her hull, too large for them to keep the water at bay. The holds were flooded, the engine room was filling, and many of the lower hallways in the bow section of the ship were completely filled with water up to their ceilings. The Ourang Medan had fallen silent again following the explosion, and the Silver Star crew watched as the vessel continued to settle ever more towards the bow. As her bow sank and settled deeper into the water, the ship's propellers began to ever so slightly poke out of the water's surface at the stern. She slipped deeper and deeper until, with a groan, she began rolling onto her side. There were faint crashes from inside as unbolted items fell and slid to the port side, and the Ourang Medan continued to roll over onto that side. As more of her submerged, the smoke around her lessened, and soon it mostly disappeared, leaving the Silver Star crew with an unobstructed view of the sinking ship. There was a flash from the stern of the Silver Star. Jimmy, who had been able to only take a few photos while on board the derelict, had thought to capture one more as she rolled over. No one spoke. Everyone stood silent on the Silver Star, watching as the ship sank. The Ourang Medan had rolled all the way over onto her port side. She was lying almost sideways in the water, but not quite, and she was settling still deeper into the water. She was still settling down by the head, but seemed to be settling level again as water flooded the entire ship through open and shattered windows rather than just the forward sections. She lost her forward list and rested an even keel on her port side, rolled over at what had to be a nearly 50 degrees list. Within the interior of the groaning ship, water was flooding hallways and slowly rising to the ceiling of each one, flowing into rooms and filling them and gushing down staircases. The dark hallways were slowly filled by the gurgling seawater as it continued to flow into the ship and flood her interiors. She began flooding fast, and she began to slip down faster. Only a few mere minutes after the explosion rocked her, the mysterious ship slipped below the waves and was gone. The starboard end of her stern was the last part of her to sink below the waves. She went down silently, just as she had been when the Silver Star crew found her. There were no rumbles or further explosions after she sank, just silence. Soon, the surface of the ocean calmed and the cloud of smoke she left in the air was blown away, and all traces of the Ourang Medan were gone. Whatever her secrets were, she'd taken them all, along with her crew, to the bottom of the ocean. 2038, Strait of Malacca, Andaman Sea meeting point. Two unmanned submersibles crept along the ocean bottom, slowly working their way towards a large radar-indicated target ahead. It was yet hidden in the gloom, which was only punctured by the lights they bore and shone out to create a bubble of illuminated water around them. They were surrounded by the intense pressure, only matched by the unfathomable darkness of the deep ocean. They bore the only lights in a void which looked like outer space if it had become devoid of stars. A darkness which could have hid anything, from a Goliath predator to a harmless, small, curious fish. Currents pushed against them, but the subs held their course that they were instructed to follow, towards the radar-indicated target that slowly drew nearer, an anomaly which didn't belong and was soon to be showered by their lights. Above them, far above them, where the world was illuminated by the sun, a single research vessel was receiving the live footage from the subs, showing the bottom of the ocean in live, high definition. Leading the expedition was a marine archaeologist and historian named Brock Ballard, a man known for discovering a few shipwrecks around the world. Now, he was searching the Strait of Malacca and the Andaman Sea for any undocumented wrecks that were present in the region, leading a study being funded by several universities, private individuals, and historical societies to fill in some of the blank pages of history. Multiple ships had been sunk in the region during both world wars, but there had never been a major expedition to find some of them. So, with the centennial of the start of World War II approaching, many had decided it was time to change that and ensure some of the lesser-known parts of history were appropriately documented and preserved. That was the official reason anyway, though everyone on board knew that he was secretly searching for, or rather hoping to come across, one wreck in particular, now that he had a chance to actually search for it. The wreck of the legendary ghost ship, Ourang Medan, which, if it was a real ship, should have been in the region. You couldn't hope to mount an official expedition to look for the ship, unless you had the money to fund it yourself, which Ballard didn't, because most thought she never existed, so no one would fund a hunt to try and find it. But Ballard had long been fascinated with the story, and a dream of his was to prove the ship indeed did really exist. Most on board knew he'd be disappointed, but officially, the expedition was about to achieve its goal. It had been a success, even if no further wrecks were located. They'd located a wreck on the ocean floor a day earlier, and had sent two submersibles down that morning to document it. It was undocumented, and the exact kind of thing they'd been sent to find. Another piece of history had been found, and would soon be added to the books once they were able to film and study it. They were now less than 50 meters from the wreck, and closing the distance. Many of Brock's colleagues around the world were aware of what he'd actually wanted to find in the region, but didn't voice their concerns. Brock Ballard, despite believing in the validity of a ghost ship which had never been found in a single registry, was a well-respected marine archaeologist. He had not only discovered multiple wrecks thought lost forever, thanks to his nature to think outside the box when it came to searching for wrecks no one else had found, he was also one of only a few people to have actually seen the wreck of the RMS Titanic in person. His reputation was more than enough to make up for his believing in a fictitious ship. Everyone could have a hobby, and everyone knew he would stay on task and not go out of his way and waste time and money to try and find it. Brock was staring, his gaze fixated, at the screen as he waited for the wreck to materialize from the darkness, like a ship on the surface would eerily materialize out of the fog. The idea alone of it being the Ourang Medan was exciting, but he didn't let himself actually believe that was the ship which was ahead. He could entertain the notion for fun, but he knew that it wasn't what was waiting ahead, and didn't let himself believe it. He might have believed in the story, and thought the ship indeed did exist, but her location would be near impossible to find. They'd been scanning the sea floor in the region for signs of undocumented wrecks, due to the number of historically important ships going down in the region over the years. And at most, he hoped the wreck ahead was one of these. They had been given a list of targets which were the most desired to be found. If not one of those, it was still a wreck no one else had found, and that meant either way, the expedition was a success. And he was excited to see which one it ended up being. Brock's assistant snorted from behind him. Look at this guy. He really thinks he's gonna find the Ourang Medan down there. Brock looked at him over his shoulder and shrugged. Hey, I keep an open mind. The ship is a myth, the assistant continued. Brock again just shrugged his shoulders. Hey, maybe. But that is an undocumented shipwreck ahead of the submersible, so that's something. There's a lot of known ships that it could be, and probably is. We're not sailing away empty-handed either way. Okay, fair enough. But come on. You know that won't be the Medan down there. Come on, people dying with their faces looking up at the sky with expressions of terror, an explosion so violent it threw the ship out of the water. I'm sure some details were exaggerated with retellings, Ballard replied. The Medan doesn't exist! Hey, I never said this was the Ourang Medan, or that she did. It could be anything. I'm not arguing with you on that fact, but like I did say, I keep an open mind. Okay, pictures then. Why are there none? Cameras weren't exactly rare in the 1940s. You've been fascinated with the story for what, your whole life? So explain that one to me. Have you never questioned it? You've been itching to ask me about this, haven't you? Okay, I'll play ball. Actually, there is a supposed photo of her showing her capsizing. I thought the ship blew up. Again, apparently so violently that it was thrown out of the water. So why would it be capsizing in the picture? Well, like I just told you, I think some details were exaggerated over the years. If anything, I'd say the more likely scenario was a small explosion rocked the ship, probably tore open the hull, and she capsized from the flooding. You can't take these stories at face value, just like the Loch Ness Monster. Also, I know some of you are taking bets on if I'll try to actually find it. No. I'm a professional, and it's not my money anyway. A voice then emitted from the static on the radio channels. She's just under 7 meters out. You should see her in the lights any time now. Ballard turned to face the screen again as the subs crept closer to the wreck. Slowly, a tall structure came into view out of the gloom, a rusting hulk of a sunken ship sitting upright on the ocean floor. Once, she might have been beautiful in her own right, but now she was merely a shadow of what she'd once been, and rusting, long forgotten, on the ocean floor with no lights or visitors. As soon as he saw it on the screen, Ballard went from joking to professional, as did everyone else. Take her up and right over the front of the bow. Let's find out what we're looking at, Ballard ordered the pilot. The lead of the two subs crept away from the ocean floor and rose up and forward until it passed over the bow of the ship. Ballard stared intently at the computer screen, broadcasting the live footage back to the research ship, taking in each detail of the wreck, looking for any clues that could give the ship her identity back. She might have once been a proud ship sailing across the untamable ocean, in a way as alive as any person, but now she was a ruin, a rusting wreck, the skeletal remains of what was once alive, forgotten on the seabed by those who lived on the surface far above, unvisited and unloved. That was how Brock always felt when he first saw a shipwreck, especially one that he was the first to discover. They always looked sad, resting on the seafloor, their rusting image a mere shadow of what they had once been so many years, sometimes centuries, before. Okay, let's see what we have here. Look for any identifying aspects, Brock said, his eyes still on the screen. Looking for traits which could be used to identify the type of ship, and the specific one, was a bit of a difficult task when the only lights were those on the two unmanned subs, one passing over the forward deck while the other passed along the starboard side railing. The bow was slightly crumpled, indicating the ship might have struck the ocean floor bow and keel first, before the rest landed and settled on the seabed. The safety rails on each side of the bow were as rusted as the ship's hull, with rusticles dangling from them that looked like the stalactites you could find in caves. The forwardmost structure of the ship, the bridge, soon came into view, and the two subs maneuvered past it, one staying on the starboard side, while the other slid around to the port side. The rusted hull was dotted with shattered portholes, and the structure up on deck likewise had no glass. The bridge seemed intact. The walls were still standing, though none of the windows had glass either. The submersible on the starboard side briefly turned to look at it. The doorway was open, no door was to be seen, and the inside looked like a dark cave. A small fish lazily drifted out and out of sight into the gloom. Inside the dark room was the vague shape which couldn't be identified. It might have been part of the steering gear or the pedestal where it had once stood. After a moment, the sub turned again and began to glide alongside the ship's upper deck towards the stern. Shortly after the bridge, the deck vanished. The ship's structure had completely caved in and collapsed into a gaping hole in the deck. The metal hull was bent and ripped open into a crevasse of collapsed doorways and fallen decks. Moving both subs down the side of the ship, the team saw the hull on both sides was torn open in the same area, and the hull and the area of the ship, resting half buried into the muddy seabed, had parts jutting out like something had blasted out of the ship. "What do you think?" Brock asked the man sitting to his left. The man was an expert on old ships from the region, named Andrew Dave Morrison. He had a head of white hair, was slightly overweight, wore a faded baby blue shirt, and had thinly framed glasses resting on his nose. He was gazing hard at every frame of the live feed. "Cargo ship of some kind, most likely. Judging from the bow and parts of the superstructure we can see, I'd say maybe Dutch or British build. Probably built in either the 1930s or 1940s, he said, leaning forward and taking in more details of the superstructure. Actually, maybe even 1920s. From what I've seen of her body and shape, she kind of reminds me of the British steam merchant Trickerel, as far as design goes, which was completed in 1919 and sank in 1941. But that's probably just my mind filling in the gaps based on what I've seen of her. She probably looked more like this, actually, he added, opening a laptop and going to a database of pictures, pulling up one of the Dutch freighter SS Chapara, taken in 1942. "Probably also something sank in World War II?" Ballard suggested, and Morrison nodded. "Yeah, probably. But that damage doesn't look like a bomb was dropped on them. That looks more like they blew up from the inside." Seeing the look on Ballard's face at the comment, Morrison shook his head and added, "Well, don't get too excited now. Probably some of that damage comes from being down here for almost a century," he said, and Ballard nodded in agreement. "I want to know what this ship is. Are there any which were lost in World War II that you know sank in this area?" Ballard asked. Morrison shook his head. "I don't know, not off the top of my head. Like I said, it looks like a Dutch freighter from the era, likely very similar looking to the Japara, but we can't know for sure until we see the whole wreck. But a lot of freighters were sunk in the war, more than we probably know about. Cargo ships were targets for obvious reasons. They didn't just carry supplies, but also troops. It would just take a Japanese plane flying overhead and a ship being in the wrong place at the wrong time. We need to look around for any features which we can match to known missing ships from the era, and if we can't find that, then features that tell us exactly what type of ship she is at least." Brock continued staring at the damage he was seeing in the live feed, and sat up abruptly. "Take the submersibles back to the bow," he said. "I've got a feeling." He trailed off, and the pilots did as told, turning both subs around and following them back along the sides of the ship back to the bow. "Right there. Look at that. What is that?" Ballard said, jumping out of his chair and pointing at something on the starboard side bow. A small wooden plaque was coming into view from out of the gloom. If there had been one on the port side, it was gone, so both subs converged on the starboard side plaque. "Is that a nameplate?" someone asked. "It is, and it's not corroded," Ballard replied. "That's because it's made of teak," the expert chimed in. Covering the nameplate was a thick layer of sediment, which rendered it unreadable, but Ballard wasn't dissuaded. "Hold the closer sub in place, right in front of it. Bring the other around and gently brush the buildup off," he ordered. Everyone watched with bated breath as the second sub crept in close and began scrubbing the grime off the teak plate. As it did, the first sub kept its lights trained on the plaque and letters began to become visible underneath the buildup as sediments were scrubbed away. Everyone was only able to stare in total, stunned silence as the name Ourang Medan became visible, perfectly preserved on the plaque despite the hull around it rusting and rotting in the live camera feed. The second sub pulled back and pointed its cameras at the plaque too, showing the name clearly in both feeds. Like a haunting specter, the most famous ghost ship in history had just, finally, revealed herself for the first time. "I'll be goddamned," Ballard said. For the next several hours, the researchers scrambled to collect data. They couldn't get the two subs around the ship fast enough in their excitement. Ballard, in particular, was like a kid in a candy store. They didn't announce their discovery yet, only sharing to colleagues back in the United States that they had located an undocumented wreck. Ballard chose to keep the wreck's identity secret until they not only fully mapped and documented it, but also swept through the surrounding area for additional debris. At the end of the expedition, Ballard was going to be presenting the findings of it to a gathering of experts and the press, with the public being able to watch the event live over the internet. They were all in for a treat even greater than they could have imagined, and Ballard could only imagine what the reaction would be when he did finally share with everyone the identity of the wreck. For hours, the two subs slowly worked their way around the wreck, but that massive open hole in the center of the ship yearned, and eventually, Ballard could not hold in his curiosity anymore. Some of the rooms in the exterior superstructure had been investigated, the bridge, for example, and they'd even found the wireless room, with the wireless set which sent out the infamous SOS still sitting on the bolted-down table. But Ballard wanted to see the inside of the hull. One of the longest unanswered mysteries about the Ourang Medan was, if she was real, then what killed her crew? Did she have some hazardous cargo on board which was responsible? "I want to see if we can't get down inside the hull. Can we get down inside the ship through the damage section?" Ballard asked 2 hours after they'd identified the ship. The lead sub was currently filming the bridge, its lights trained on an overturned locker lying rusted but intact on the floor. The sub backed up out of the doorway and maneuvered towards the aft section of the wreck. The operator shook his head. "Maybe. You realize the ship's been down here for 90 years, right? We nudge anything inside her and the whole structure might collapse." "Hey, we just proved one of the greatest ocean mysteries of all time did indeed occur. Now I want to know if we can't find any clues about what killed her crew." The torn open section of the hull came into view, and the sub detached an ROV down into the collapsed section. Amid the torn metal and fallen decks, one black doorway appeared near the bottom, an intact hallway which was unobstructed. "Go in, right there," Ballard said, pointing at the screen and jumping slightly. "Calm down, I see it," the operator replied, feeling fed up already. He urged the smaller robot forward into the dark opening, the lights illuminating a long hallway, free of blockage. "Just think," Ballard said as the ROV eased further inside and illuminated more of the hull and its lights. "We're seeing a place no one has seen for nearly a century." The ROV moved further along the hull, the deteriorated walls still holding the ceiling up. Open doorways leading into dark rooms appeared on either side, but the ROV kept moving forward, and Ballard kept his gaze on the screen the feed was being sent back to. "Hey, is there access to the cargo holds on this level?" Ballard asked. One of the theories about the disaster was that the cargo had something to do with the crew's death. "Should be if we're on the right deck, but with all the damage outside, I'm not sure which we're on exactly. This hallway, though, should lead to a door which leads to the hold if we're on the right one," Morrison answered. The ROV crept deeper into the wreck. The interior of the ship seemed in relatively good condition, despite both the violent end she endured before sinking and spending nearly a century underwater. She was certainly fragile, though, and the operator kept the ROV clear from the walls to avoid any kind of scrape or collision. There, Ballard suddenly said, jumping up and pointing at the end of the hallway, which was beginning to emerge from the gloom. There's an open hatch, and it looks like there's a big open space behind it. The operator took his hands off the ROV control for a moment in frustration, and the ROV stopped moving and lightly settled on the hallway floor, slightly stirring up the sediments. I got it, he sighed. Just relax. I get you're excited, but calm down. I don't need a coach. I got this. He urged the vehicle forward again, further down the hallway, and soon the open hatch came fully into view. Behind was a cavern of darkness, and the end of a collapsed catwalk was visible just behind the doorway. Ballard clapped his hands and smiled. Cargo hold, baby, get in there! The ROV slowly crept forward and squeezed through the opening. The hatch was still on the hinge and swung fully open. Seeing that it was left open, Ballard turned to Morrison. Those types of hatches were watertight. Do you think if it was closed, it would have kept the ship from sinking? Morrison shook his head. Not if she sank as fast as the story says she did. One closed watertight hatch would make a difference with that kind of damage. They watched as the ROV moved through the open door and into the open space, out of the claustrophobic hallway and down into the void below, going slow in case of any unseen debris which might loom out of the darkness unexpectedly. The open room of the hold was like a black void or an underwater cavern, and the lights could not reach the wall, making the space feel much larger than it probably really was. Some twisted, rusted metal came into view as the ROV descended, and the operator moved it aside to avoid the collapsed catwalk. The last thing they needed was the ROV to be caught on that. It would be as stuck as the Spirit rover on Mars became. As the ROV descended deeper into the gloom, into the bowels of the dead ship, the floor of the hold finally came into view. A thick layer of muddy sediment had built up on the floor, but a pile of round objects came into view. What are those? Ballard asked, pointing as the objects barely came into view on the cargo hold floor. The objects weren't buried, as the sediments had built up on the opposite side of the hold than where the objects were laying. The operator moved the ROV to the left to shine more light on the round objects. One light directly hit them, and it became obvious what they were. Barrels. Maybe some kind of chemical drums? The sub-operator said, moving the ROV closer to the hold floor. It snaked its way down, and indeed the objects were revealed in its close-up lights to be rusted metal drums of some kind, toppled over with their lids long gone. What hold are we in? Ballard asked, turning away from the monitor. Morrison was looking at the ROV feed and paused. Well, if we compare the Ourang Medan, based on what we've seen, to other similar Dutch cargo ships from the time, probably cargo hold 3. That's one compartment forward of where the fire started, Ballard muttered. He looked back at the live feed on the monitor and asked, That ROV has arms, right? The operator nodded. Grab one of those barrels. I want to see if we can't find out what was in them. The operator nodded and activated the ROV's arms. He moved the robot closer and stopped just above one of the barrels and extended the claw-like hands out and grasped onto one of the barrels by its lip. Careful, careful. Easy now. Easy, easy, Ballard urged as the operator attempted to lift the barrel up off the floor. Immediately, a bunch of sediment was kicked up and the metal began to break apart. Forget it, stop, Ballard said, and the operator released his grasp on the barrel. The crumbling metal drum fell back to the hold floor. Try with one of the other ones, Ballard urged. The operator obliged and moved to one of the other barrels, one on top of a small pile of others. He grasped it with the claws and began to lift. Careful, careful. Easy, easy, Ballard said. I got it, the operator assured. The drum managed to hold together as it was lifted up off the pile. Okay, flip it over, Ballard said. And the ROV operator again obliged. He flipped the barrel over and dropped it back into the pile, kicking up more sediments which needed to clear. As they did, the barrel came back into view on the camera amid the murk and floating mud, and everyone saw, amid the rust and corrosion, the faint letters stamped onto it, still clearly visible amid the rust, which read, GA, Variant B. For the second time that day, as he stared at the possible answer to one of the most mysterious, unsolved maritime mysteries in history, Brock Ballard said the words, "I'll be goddamned."